Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third webinar of the Governing for Reform in Aged Care program. My name is Mary Claire McDonald. I'll be facilitating the panel discussion today on governing for consumer-centred care. I'd like to just invite you before we start to have a little look at the layout that we're working with today. If you're finding that you can't see properly, the boxes that you can see on your screen are all able to be shifted and moved, so you can drag them around. You can increase the size of whichever box you would like to see most prominently. There are also some little buttons down the bottom that you can use. There's a questions and answers button that you can use if you're having trouble. Someone will be able to assist you. We won't be taking questions from the audience for today's webinar. It will just be a viewing only webinar. But if you do have a burning question, you want to pop it in there, we will be checking those questions after the session. So if you want to pop a question in there, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So I'd like to start today by just acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're all calling in from today. So I'm on Gadigal country. The Gadigal people of the Eora Nation are the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders, past, present and emerging, of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have looked after the lands that you're all calling in from today, and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' deep feelings of attachment and relationship to country, and also to give my personal gratitude for the amazing job that they have done of looking after this land for tens and thousands of years, that we're all calling home now. So I'd love for you to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that you're calling in from as well. So as I mentioned, today we're here to discuss consumer-centred approaches, and we've got three very accomplished panel members here who are going to bring a diverse range of perspectives to this topic. I know it looks like I'm here by myself, but they are sitting in the background, I guarantee. So today we have Arundhati Jayakody. I'm sorry, Arundhati, I knew I'd stumble over your name. Ian Yates and Mark Hassel. I'm just going to give a brief introduction of all three, and then I'll invite them to come onto the screen. Arundhati is a mental health consumer advocate, board member and senior project lead at the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council. She draws on her personal experience of living with a mental health condition to promote consumer leadership and elevate consumer perspectives. She was a member of the Expert Advisory Committee to the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system. Currently, Arundhati is a board member at Mind Australia, co-chair of the Independent Advisory Board to the Alive Centre, tribunal member at the Mental Health Tribunal Victoria, and a member of the Advisory Board to the Australian Mental Health Prize. She's also co-editor of the book Peer Workforce in Australia, A New Future for Mental Health, and is a practiced law and has experience in legal profession regulation. She's also recently designed and established the first specialist governance program developed by and for mental health consumers in Australia. So Arundhati will be joining us in a moment, along with Ian Yates, who probably needs no introduction in this audience, but he's the Chief Executive of the Council on the Ageing, CODA Australia, the peak national consumer body for older Australians. Ian's played national leadership roles in CODA since 2002, after being Chief Executive of CODA South Australia since 1989. He's also chair of the newly established Ageing and Aged Care Council of Elders, a member of the National Aged Care Advisory Council and the Aged Care Quality and Safety Advisory Council, and was a member of the Aged Care Financing Authority from 2012 to 2021. He also represents older Australians on several other key federal government and sector advisory bodies, which are many, so I won't name them all because we don't have all day. And Ian has held senior positions in public health governance and essential services in South Australia throughout the 2000s. He served on the Flinders University Council for 20 years, including 7 years as Deputy Chancellor, and is Emeritus Deputy Chancellor of Flinders University and holds an honorary doctorate from that university. He was awarded membership in the Order of Australia in June 2005. Welcome in. And Mark Hassel. Mark spent the majority of his career in senior and other leadership positions in the airline industry. Mark joined KPMG 4 years ago as one of the launch partners in the customer brand and marketing practice. Mark's primary focus at KPMG is to drive greater citizen outcomes and improved organisational performance through his clients in state, federal and international governments. He's also the KPMG Joint Lead Partner for New South Wales Government of Customer Service. Mark brings a wealth of experience from the airline industry, where he implemented a consumer-centred focus which was successfully incorporated for airlines such as Virgin Australia, where he was the Chief Customer Officer, British Airways, where he was Global Head of Customer Experience, and Qantas. So I'd like to just welcome our panellists onto the screen now. See, I told you they were there. Welcome, everybody. So we're going to have a really good discussion today. We're going to keep it nice and casual. So what we've decided to do for those in the audience is to make this a discussion that you can be a fly on the wall in. I'm not going to get in the way too much with questions. We're going to have our panellists bouncing off each other as much as answering questions from me. So where we'll start is that consumer-centred care is care and services designed around an individual's needs, preferences, background. It includes a partnership between consumers and providers. And what I thought we'd start with is just a very sort of general overview on what consumer-centred care means. And Ian, I thought we'd go to you first with this question, since you have got the deepest sort of experience in aged care. I wonder if you could give us a brief overview on what consumer-centred care really looks like in practice in aged care.
Thanks for that. Yes, I'm going to start by saying that the term consumer-centred care is regarded with some degree of hesitancy and scepticism by many consumers and consumer advocates. And that's because traditionally in the aged care sector, people will say, well, the consumer is at the centre of all we do. But that what they really mean by that, to be blunt about it, is we're focused on the consumer, but we know what they need. And so we've designed all these things for the consumer. Whereas what we mean by consumer-centred care is that you start with a blank sheet in a design sense, and you start in dialogue, in engagement with the consumer about what it is that they are wanting, why and how, and then start to build your service around that. And obviously, if there's a group of consumers, then you're building it around a group, and you need to work all those dynamics out, which we can talk about. But that's where you're starting, and that's the use of the term these days, which has become a bit jargon and not fully understood, of co-design. But it's a fundamental cultural shift for people to say, let's start with where the consumer is, and let's look. So a practical example of that would be a major provider. One of the better providers was going through a strategic review process as we led up to what were then the new aged care standards. And I've been in now for a while, but the first of those is that people will be treated with dignity and respect. And they were going through, well, how would we be a bit more focused on the consumer? How would we adjust things? And as they struggled with that tension, they had one of those if I can dare use the term, light bulb moments, where they suddenly realised that what they needed to do was, in terms of their meal service, which they were looking at that time, the whole meal service, what actually would people like? And then how would we build a service system that was around what people would like? For example, people might like to be able to access food services over an 18-hour period of a day. So how would we do that? And then the question would be, how do we get from where we are now to then? Rather than how do we marginally and incrementally try and juggle our system around what the consumer wants. So I'll stop there and let others come in, but that's a kind of fundamental shift. And it's because, as I said, because consumers listen all the time to being told they're at the centre, but then experience that they're really at the periphery.
Thanks, Ian. I might kick over to you, Arundhati, because I'm sure you have views on this, being a person who has multiple perspectives in your context. So would you like to give us your view on what that what consumer-centred care looks like, but also you have been a consumer that has had very strong views on this, so I'd love that perspective as well.
Thank you, Mary Claire. I think Ian really summed it up. The ultimate question is, are we delivering services that people like and need? So, do we have a system that delivers good outcomes? And in my case, where, in the mental health sector, we don't. We continue to deliver poor outcomes in terms of mental health outcomes, physical health outcomes, and socioeconomic outcomes. And on top of that, we have a system that actually causes harm and also infringes on people's rights. We still mechanically restrain people. We put people in seclusion. And in fact, today, Victoria is releasing its seclusion and restraint report as we speak, actually at 12:30. So I highly recommend that you do take the time to read that. And on top of that, the Mental Health Tribunal actually grants compulsory treatment orders where we put people under anesthesia without their consent and give them electroshock treatment. So the point I'm trying to highlight is we have a system that doesn't meet the needs of the people. And I think if it's IT speak, I think it's called system is not fit for purpose. And the only way to actually have a system that meets the needs of the people is to ask people and work with them. And the Royal Commission, one of the things that they said was that the perspective of the consumers are consistently overlooked. It's not just historical, we do that currently as well. That's because, the consumers in the mental health sector are the stigma, discrimination, and marginalization that people experience it's very real. It's not historical from the asylum times. So, and one way to address that really is to not just ask consumers, but actually work with consumers. Again, asking is easy because people, we do consultations, we ask for advisory bodies, but it often gets ignored. What happens is, oh yeah, that's great, but we've got really tight timelines, we don't have the budget for that. So one of the things that the Royal Commission was very clear on is that there must be people with lived experience or consumers sitting on boards at the governance level in terms of regulation. How do we regulate the system? How do we allocate funding? That sort of thing. And one of the things that we are finding challenging is, so suddenly there's a call on people, the call on consumers to sit at these governing bodies, but we don't actually have enough consumers, because what is required is to provide a consumer perspective. Because just because you have a lived experience doesn't mean you suddenly know how to regulate the system or how to govern the system. It requires two things. One is, how do you have to have an understanding of how your lived experience relates to that wider context. How do you place your lived experience in terms of the wider socioeconomic context? And that's what we mean by consumer perspective. And that needs to be combined with the technical skill set. So, your usual governance, financial literacy, enterprise risk, and so on. So I'll just leave it there for the moment.
I'm actually interested to know a little bit more about what you're saying, Arundhati. Have you seen some changes in your space from bringing those consumer voices more into those decision-making forums? Have you seen any promising changes?
Yes, I have. So again, as a result of the Royal Commission, Victoria has to establish, I think, 9 regional bodies that will do the commissioning moving forward. And all the bodies have 2 consumers and 2 families and carers. And there's a new research centre, the Victorian Collaborative Centre, that will again have 2 consumers and 2 carers. These were actually written into the recommendations, and these are being written into the actual legislation and the legal instruments that would govern them. And again, I do want to highlight, when I said early on that the perspective of the consumers are consistently being overlooked, in the Victorian context, in the Royal Commission, when it handed down the interim report, it said that a interim body must be set up to do the interim recommendations. And in setting up that office, what the government did was they appointed a CEO, chief executive, and senior advisor clinical, but there was no senior advisor consumer or family carer. So that's a classic example of this was implementation of the interim recommendations of the Royal Commission, and the perspective of the consumer was overlooked. So, it is consistently overlooked, and that's why moving forward, in the final report of the Royal Commission, they actually specified this in the recommendation, not just in commentary. So we do see changes coming, and hopefully as we have people sitting on those decision-making levels, there'll be a flow-on effect, making sure that throughout the system, we do have the consumer perspective embedded in the system.
Thanks, Arundhati. Now, Mark, I'm going to kick over to you now, because one of the things that we're hearing just very early in the conversation is that there is a need for change, and change can be quite tricky. And I know that you have quite a lot of experience in helping big commercial organisations make quite large changes to strengthen their approaches to sort of customer centricity. And that's kind of why you're joining us today, because you've got a lot of experience in a different context that we thought might be interesting to hear about. Even though it doesn't apply directly, I'm sure there are some lessons that you can share with us that you've learned over the years of trying to bring in these sorts of approaches. So first of all, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what customer centricity looks like from your perspective, why it has been important for you to focus on that, and what results you've kind of seen in your work.
Yeah, sure. I think the starting point is, I think my learned friends have really come at it from 2 different dimensions, which is great. From my perspective, the bit the kind of perhaps meat in the sandwich I can bring to this is the sense that, look, the starting point is that consumer expectations have never been higher than they are today, and the speed of change that we all expect has never been faster. So if you're an organization for whom change is something you don't do, then by definition, you're not standing still, you're actually moving backwards, and you're moving backwards at an increasingly fast rate. So I think that's the first thing that I would say. The other thing, picking up on one of the points Ian made a bit earlier, in a lot of organizations, when you're moving towards a customer-centered starting point, it's not unusual, as Ian touched on, for organizations to have a sizable percentage of their team and leaders who actually believe they know what great is. And that is not to suggest that they, in any way, shape or form, are not delivering good things, but their ability to stay connected with where everything is going in terms of speed of change and what customer expectations are all about is often a barrier and blocker to where an organization needs to get to. I think the critical thing from a change perspective is, the aged care sector, the customers within the aged care sector, they're equally getting informed from their experience with the Amazons, or what they hear from their grandchildren with the Airbnbs, or what they get online if they've actually got a connected lifestyle within which that they enjoy and provide access to things. So it's not an aged care to aged care comparator that people actually look at. They look at, what does great service look like in whatever facet of life, and therefore everybody's less tolerant as to why that quality of service cannot be delivered in other elements of their life as well. So it's game on in the sense that, you know, you can't pigeonhole what good looks like by sector and assume that's as good as it needs to get. I think in terms of what you kind of need to do about it, a combination of things really. The first thing is you've got to deeply understand who your customers are, who are the ones that you've got, who are the ones that you want, and what are their drivers of satisfaction. Fundamentally, what are they, and what is it actually going to take to get there? The competitive set has never been greater than it is today. You know, there's a lot of competition out there. There are a lot of new organizations out to kind of steal your lunch and take your customers one way or another. So what is your value proposition? What is it that you bring that can really create a marriage between the need and want of the customer you've got or the one that you want, and what it is that you provide? How can you do that? And this doesn't necessarily mean lots and lots of money either. It can be quite nuanced. It can be just fundamentally positioning what you do, how you do it, and the way you deliver it in a way that people go, you know what, that's exactly what I need. That's exactly what I need. Another critical element would be, you know, do what you say. So, you know, create the expectations, but you need to deliver what it is, what the promise actually is. People are very unforgiving if there is a great promise out there, great advertising campaign, great communications, but it fundamentally is flawed when you actually get into it. So that isn't good. That kind of moves you back, you know, pretty significantly. And really, it can't be a set and forget. It is a journey of continuous improvement. It's like, you know, painting the harbour bridge, you never finish. You've got to stay on the front foot, and you've got to stay ahead of the party, really. If I just go on to your question about, Mary Claire, the, you know, instigating change within an organisation, critical things. Leaders have got to be believers. That's the first thing. So if we know what it is that we go, where we're going, what that success looks like, and what change looks and feels like, if your leaders from the top down don't get that, don't embrace it, do not feel that they've got skin in the game, then the change is not going to happen. I mean, that is a reality of life. You need to create a team sport here. It's got to be a compelling vision for change, and the team have got to understand why this is a good thing and why them being part of it is an even better thing. So you've got to bring people on the journey and really start to paint the pictures as to what great looks like going forward. So just at a high level, that's where I'd start on the people front. And there's a million things that sit underneath that. But leaders have got to be believers, have a very clear vision, harness the power and talent of your organization behind it, and create pathways for them to deliver.
Thanks, Mark. Ian, back to you. The aged care sector is in a period of rapid change, I guess we could say, and also things are difficult at the moment with COVID-19 and all these kind of situations that are causing stress in the sector. What do you think are the main challenges for leaders in aged care organisations in bringing these consumer-centred approaches to their discussions as governing bodies or as senior leadership teams?
I certainly agree the sector is undergoing and will continue to undergo, because although not everybody has all the information about it, the reforms that were agreed by the previous government and the additional ones by the new government as a result of the Royal Commission are extremely comprehensive and are being implemented at a fairly fair clip. And that's putting a lot of pressure on people at the same time as they've been dealing with COVID, and they're dealing with major workforce pressures. But it's a question of, as you deal with those things collaboratively and with the new government and so on, that you are thinking about this issue at the same time, because it is, you know, what are you going to come out the other side like? And I agree with Mark, coming out the other side is going to be a more competitive environment than has ever been the case in aged care. For example, one of the traditional constraints in terms of residential aged care has been the aged care planning processes, the aged care approvals round, bed licenses and so on, which meant if you were a really good provider and you saw an area in which there were poor providers and you wanted to move in there, you couldn't because there were already enough bed licenses. That's disappearing. Organisations are planning for that change right now. So the providers that are actually understanding their customers and going forward are going to be in a much better position. The other observation I'd make to people who say, well, it's really hard, we've got to deal with these issues before we deal with that issue, is all providers out there are operating in the same financial and regulatory environment. And it's not me saying that some things are possible. Providers are demonstrating that things are possible and other providers are not doing it. So it's really thinking fundamentally, who do we want to be as we move through this period of constant change and at the moment really significant challenge that we need to help. What kind of staff are we recruiting as we go through the effort of trying to find additional staff, because most providers need them? What kind of staff are we? What is the job we're telling people? And related to that is the fact that an organisation that has empowered consumers, that is, are engaged with its consumers, engaged with its customers, is getting their constant feedback and utilising it. Those people have to have empowered staff, because who is it? How does the organisation basically interface? It interfaces with those staff who have the most to do with the consumers, with the older people, and indeed the families. So that's where the interface is. And if the message, to take Mark's thing, if you're saying we're delivering and the execs are wandering around saying we're delivering all this fantastic stuff, but that's not what's happening at the coalface, then it's not happening. So it is about the staff being part of that vision. And as much as you listen to the consumer, you also got to listen to the staff. Now that can be an interesting challenge in the change process, because if you've been operating out of one culture for a long time, then your staff have been inculcated that culture. If you want to shift it, some of them will immediately see the advantages of it, but others will, as many people are, be resistant. So you have to have that change process. And I think probably one of the other messages I'd have is that to do this properly, you actually need to bring in some expertise in areas that, if you haven't been, that you're not good at, like have you really been engaged with your customers, with your consumers? If you're not, bring in some people. Don't have to be in an aged care experience. It's transferable skills across a number of sectors to help you in that process, who are independent of you. Because just to finally say, another consideration in all of this is, in aged care as compared to some other commercial environments, there is a significant power imbalance, a significant vulnerability in the consumer. People come to aged care out of a situation usually of crisis. It's a system they don't know and understand. It's complex for the people that work in it. So huge vulnerability, frightened of sticking your neck out. This is changing, but significantly changing now, but that's traditionally been what's happened. And aged care has been dominated by providers and government, and consumers have not had a look in, and that needs to change. But it won't just change overnight, and it's got to be nurtured and encouraged.
So, thanks, Ian. Jumping off one of your questions, I want to kick over to you, Arundhati. How do we empower consumers? So how do we encourage them to come forward and really engage in these processes, like the sort of program you've recently set up to engage consumers' voices in governance? How do we do that?
Thanks, Mary Claire. Before I do that, I want to pick up on 2 points that Mark and Ian said. Mark talked about the importance of vision. And I think, ultimately, both in the aged care sector and the mental health care system, what we want is how can people lead a good life? So in the aged care center, in the older age, what does a good life look like? In the mental health sector, how can you lead a good and meaning life with a mental health condition? And I think ultimately it's about being able to lead a life of dignity, having your autonomy and having control over your life. And I think we forget that fundamental, that is what we are trying to do. You might express it in a different way in terms of your, strategic plan, whatever. But I think we forget that. And it's so important to remember that. And as Ian said, people enter the system at a crisis point. And that often at that, that goes to that power imbalance. Unlike the aviation industry, for example, if you're unhappy with Virgin, you go to British Airways. But we don't have that luxury in the aged care sector or the mental health sector. So because of that power imbalance, lack of choice, and the vulnerability that Ian talked about is the importance of empowerment. So at that individual level, it's about, how does our complaints and process work? Do people feel safe enough to make a complaint when they know that they're going to receive these services and they don't have a choice to leave that service? So at an individual level, how does that work? Is your staff trained appropriately to do that? What does conflict resolution look like? But then at a systemic level, so for example, governance and senior leadership, when you suddenly invite consumers to take up these positions, again, goes to Mark's point where Mark said, we've suddenly got management that thinks, they know what this is about, but they don't actually. And again, it's the culture, it's not the individual arrogance, so to speak. If we do want to fix that system, we really need the consumers being part of the solution, actually working within the system. And so what we find is consumers are suddenly being asked to step into these positions without the know-how, so to speak. So as I said, in Victoria, we've suddenly got this call for consumers to sit on these governing bodies. That's why we put together this specialist governance training program. There's a few unique features about that. First is that in terms of the content, we looked at things, the governance 101, as I said, financial literacy, enterprise risk, etc. But we also looked at what does this power imbalance look like, the consumer perspective, how does that play out within the system? And because it's really important that governing bodies are aware of that. And we also looked at alternative things like culturally adaptive governance framework. What does critical allyship look like in terms of affecting change? And then again, looking at clinical governance, you're all familiar with the concepts of safety and quality. But again, ultimately, it's about upholding people's rights. How do we promote people's autonomy, making sure that they get services that they need? Again, it's about taking it to that fundamental levels, but that's how we approach clinical governance. So the actual content looked different. And the other thing was we had a consumer co-facilitator throughout the whole 4 days. So there was a technical expert, and then we had a consumer bringing in the consumer lens. So for example, when we did the enterprise risk unit, we had, fabulous, really well, lot of technical knowledge, very respected in the sector, doing all the enterprise risk stuff. And with that, we had a co-facilitator that actually a consumer-run organization. So they were able to bring how does a consumer-run organization approach enterprise risk. So for example, they talked about things like dignity of risk. How does dignity of risk fit within an risk matrix and things like that? So that is the unique thing about the training. And the other thing we also did was, there's no point in doing this, it's by consumers for consumers, but we need to bring the sector along this journey as well. So our program is 6 months long. We did the training, but we also had a placement component. And there were two reasons for doing that. Firstly, to kind of see how this plays out in an actual boardroom. but also to get the sector buy-in. So the sector to be aware of what this is like, and to get them exposed, so they will then see the value of this, and we'll make sure that there is consumer representation or consumer perspective at that governance level. So that's just one example of how we can empower consumers to have a say in how the system is run.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, I know I might direct this one to you, Mark, but others feel free to jump in. I know that there's been some research that showed that consumer-centred approaches actually increase the engagement of staff in organisations as well. So it can have multi-layered benefits, not just benefits for consumers. So what you were talking about, Ian, before about engaging not just consumers but also staff, because they're the people that are having to deliver services day to day. So Mark, I wondered if you've seen any evidence of that in the organisations that you've worked in, where you've put in place sort of actions to increase consumer or customer centricity, and that in turn has increased engagement in the workforce.
Customer-centric lens into the workplace, and by kind of design, it has a positive impact on the staff. Equally, flipping it the other way, which is, by the way, we are in the centre of the Great Resignation. Lots of people are giving up their jobs and doing different things, and so it's very hard to find people. By doing it the other way, which is to say, what is our employer brand? What do we stand for? And why is it fantastic working here? What is the employee experience all about? You start to really activate and amplify the role of the employee as part of the broader ecosystem of better service outcomes. We've got loads and loads of data that says if you've got happy people, if you've got an engaged workforce, if you've got an enabled workforce, you've got to give them you've got to give them the tools to do the job. There's no point in running an ad campaign if at the end of the day the tools are just fundamentally not in place for the staff to deliver. You're going to lose them. But the marriage, in fact, we're doing a piece of work in Victoria at the moment, actually, in the health system, where the first cab off the rank is a review of the maturity of employee experience. That's the starting point from which we're looking at patient experience, measurement frameworks, roadmaps of change, all aligning around critical kind of service and product offerings that meet or exceed people's needs, and importantly, looking at the dollars, looking at the cost to serve and how do you do it in the most efficient way. So there is an absolute absolute clarity that an alignment with employee experience and customer experience, patient experience, whatever it is, have got a very powerful nexus that really turbo boosts your ability to change. If you leave your staff behind, they're going to be unwilling participants. It's a suboptimal outcome. As I say, your leaders don't believe they want to step in and step up. So you do need this vision for change. Why do you want me to change? What is it you want me to do? Set me up for success. Don't make me feel an idiot. I feel as if I'm on a journey of self-development and professional development. That's great. Just give me the tools to do it. If you don't do that, organizations fundamentally struggle, and their vision is sub-optimized when they try and deliver it.
Ian, do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree with all that. I was just thinking, as Mark was talking about, a provider who I won't know, but a reasonable sized regional provider with half a dozen residential provider and retirement living, half a dozen facilities. New CEO some years ago brought in to change the culture. That encountered some resistance in the management of some of those providers, was embraced by others. As the change happened in the organisation, at one conference that she spoke at, she said that an unexpected product was the three that had now embraced a much more consumer-centric culture, had empowered the staff. The thing that she hadn't planned for but was happening was those were the three that were performing financially best. and the ones that were in the old culture were not. And eventually that was over the whole of the organisation. So it was a very practical example of that. It took some years to fully get it because, as I said, there was resistance from old leadership, but the change led to a more profitable organisation as well as a more attractive organisation, and an organisation also, might say, that is now much more integrated into its local communities, because that's one of the things that the consumers want. So that it's a much more seamless experience. These are all things that are not traditionally associated with aged care. So, that's I just pointed out as a very practical example.
Yeah, I love a practical example. And Arundhati, do you have any views on that, or any examples you could share of where you've seen that happening in your context?
Thank you, Mary Claire. Agree with both Mark and Ian. I think staff training and staff satisfaction is crucial to what we do, and one of the things that we find in the mental health sector is people are burnt out. We will often hear that psychiatrists are leaving the mental health sector and going to the private sector because it's difficult and very difficult to find mental health nurses, etc. And again, there's been so much underinvestment in learning and development in the mental health sector. So, for example, some of the most recently established clinical wards, what staff said was, we need seclusion rooms because we don't actually we don't have the skill set to manage consumers when they become really, really unwell. So because of that, it becomes this, both staff suffer as well as consumers, because we know there's a lot of people who are traumatized working in the clinical sector. And so there's been underinvestment, and it's really, really important that we provide learning and development. So we actually have one health service in Barwon that's actually established a new mental health service, doesn't have seclusion rooms. That service was, we're going to do it. We're going to invest in our staff and see how it works. And again, this also comes down to what we call critical allyship, because in the mental health sector, we've had the Productivity Commission at the Commonwealth level, and in Victoria, we've had the Royal Commission. So suddenly we're talking about consumer-centric services, good outcome for consumers, and also the importance of consumer perspective. And the reality is then staff suddenly feel like, oh, wow, everything we do is wrong. How do we, they feel like what they've been doing is devalued. And I think it's really important to make the point to say, no, what we need is to actually work together. Because I don't think anybody enters this sector, the aged care sector or the mental health sector, saying, I want to make money in terms of at staff level. They do come because there is an alignment of values. So we also need to look at this idea of critical allyship to say, how can we work together to deliver good outcomes for consumers, and as well as make sure that there is staff satisfaction.
Can I just add to that, Mary Claire, if that's possible? I think when it comes to people and people change, employee change, it's scary. It's really difficult. It's telling people that their jobs are going to need to evolve, or their contribution needs to be sharpened up, or the things that are going to be more important now that were not particularly seen as important are going to be predominantly why you're there. That's tough stuff, particularly in sectors where people have been in there for quite some time. But it is doable. It is very doable. And I two examples which you probably think are not related, but trust me, they are. When I ran the crew division at Qantas, I had 9,000 staff. 25% of the group, all lovely people in their own way, all very, very committed to the business in their own way. 20 to 25% actively worked against me. 10% were role models, game changers, evangelists for positive change, and there was a big group in the middle that were kind of fence sitters, came to work and did their job. That's good, but they were not going to be strivers. They were not going to be there for change. You paint a vision of what the future's all about. You demonstrate what great looks like. And at the end of the day, in aged care, disability services, mental health, happier customers is less complaints, is less apologizing, is less of all the difficult customer related interactions. People are in a more positive space. As a staff member, as a leader, you are presiding over a far more positive range of service delivery outcomes. What's not to like? As you start to shift that, you start to then get the group of team players who don't really, those that really don't want to move, there's not a lot you can do. Those that are in the middle, which is the bulk, start to move and migrate across to what actually this more positive future looks like, and they can see a pathway of how the organization is helping them get there. So however big the organizations are, this stuff it's doable. You've got to be bold, you've got to be brave, you've got to have a vision, and you've got to stick with it. And as I said earlier, the leaders have got to be believers in making it happen.
Yeah, and agreeing with all that, another dimension as well, because I think one of the reactions of some providers to this kind of discussion is, oh, well, let's do a survey of our consumers, our customers, or let's set up a committee. Now, what I would say is, I'm not going to say no, never do a survey or don't set up a committee, but it's actually what is happening on a day-by-day basis. It's the interactions with someone's experience that went well or didn't go well. It's being able to pick that up, feed that in, understand that that's encouraged and will have an impact, so that it's real time. Doing a client experience survey in aged care, which government's talking about at the moment once a year, is frankly almost a waste of time. The people aren't going to remember. People are going to not have the same kind of passion that they had when something went wrong to talk about it. And to be just blunt, as I'm often, many of our customers in residential aged care won't remember what happened in the morning, in the afternoon, but you can pick up their experience if you've got a system to pick it up when it's happening. Those things, combined with other more formal channels working together, will then give your board, and I'm conscious we're talking about governance here, channels to your board that flow independent of the executive, that come from the raw material of the culture change that's going on.
Ian, I'm glad you brought that up. Oh, yeah, sorry, around the go first. Yeah.
If I may add something very quickly, Mark, that was fantastic with the context example you gave. In the mental health sector, one of the things that we find is also there needs to be that critical allyship and collaboration at a systems level. So how does the Mental Health Complaints Commissioner work with the peak bodies to bring about change? Now, the new commissioning bodies, how do they work with the peak bodies? And then we've got the College of, Royal College of Psychiatrists, for example, and Occupational Therapy Australia. So I think I imagine that's the same thing for the aged care sector as well. There's all these agencies that play a part in it. So within the organization, of course, you need to look at staff training, etc. But again, I think as organizations, we have a responsibility to work with the wider sector as well, in how we bring about change, because then that becomes a challenge for the sector. Everybody's going through that, not just your organization and not just that team.
Yeah. Arundhati, I might pose this question to you. I'm interested in Ian's view as well, though, because going back to Ian's pick up before about how this is about governance. One question I have that I think will be our sort of wrap-up question for today is, what do you think are the shifts that need to be occurring in the conversations happening around board tables or within boards, amongst board members? What do you think needs to shift in those conversations to bring a more consumer-centric view of their work as governing bodies?
Two things, Mary Claire. First is, as I said, in the mental health sector, so we've got this thing where suddenly consumers are being asked to sit on these boards, right? Very high-level boards. And when I started at Mind Australia a couple of years ago, one of the things I asked each of the board members is, I said, what do you think is unique about my role? What do you expect? And they said, you're here to hold us accountable. And my thing was, that's everyone's role, not just me, right? And in our training also, we had some other, guest speakers, and they said, oh, the consumer board member role is same, but different. But I think the first thing is to recognize that there must be a basic understanding of, in the mental health sector, what we call consumer perspective, and basic understanding of each board member. So, we expect all the board members to have basic understanding, financial literacy, legal, regulatory stuff. Similarly, all the board members need to have that basic understanding of what does, what is it that we're trying to do. Have that deep knowledge of that. What we talked about, what is autonomy, dignity, control over one's life. So that really basic understanding of it, because there's a lot of thinking and knowledge and theory behind it. That should be one of the fundamental skill sets at a board level. And the other thing is, how does a board monitor outcome? I'm not talking about outputs, because often what we monitor is bed days, are people being showered appropriately, etc. Those are outputs. We need to look at, are we supporting people to lead a good life? Now, I know there's a lot of questions about, outcome measures. What's a good outcome measure? So my one thing for board members would be, it's really important that you scrutinize outcome measures with the same vigor and frequency as you monitor financial KPIs.
Is that happening? Do you see that happening?
No, I don't. But I think there's going to be a shift, because with the establishment of the new Mental Health Commission in Victoria, one of their key responsibilities is to establish outcome measures and report against it. So hopefully we will see a shift in that, because I think that's what we need. Without that, we don't know whether we're actually doing we're doing what we say we're doing, because in the private sector, your share prices would reflect that.
Yeah. Miranda, I am hearing a little opportunity for you to have not only your governance training for consumers course, but a little course for board members on all those things that you're talking about. But anyway,
it's covered in the program, because if it is meant to be. Anyway, yes.
Yeah. Ian, over to you. What are your thoughts? What needs to change in these board conversations?
Well, absolutely. I think the question, as we've just heard, the question is, what are we achieving here? What are we trying to deliver? Is it a series of outputs, which is kind of what some of the current government's quality review processes and so on are aiming at, or what is the customer experience? Are we adding value to the lives of the people who are coming here to use our services? Are we making a positive difference? The good life, you can have a different terminology for it. Are we doing that? And then the fundamental question is, how do we know? Do we know what they want? Do we know what would be added value in their lives? If we haven't even engaged at that point, at that level, from the moment that there was first contact, how do we know? And then how do we measure that? And I might say that the providers who focus in that kind of way, rather than spending almost all their time talking about the money, the staffing issues, government regulation and so on, but actually about the customers, in the end, those providers are going to have the answers to what the system should look like into the future better than the clunky regulatory approaches that government is putting in place in response to the Royal Commission, which the providers cannot complain about, because I have to say they've had the opportunity to do what I've been talking about for some years now and have not done it. So, and therefore we ended up with far too many underperforming parts of the system, and you end up with the Royal Commission recommendations and government implementation. But the opportunity is still there to strive to be excellent, but you have to have the information, you have to have You have to have the commitment of getting it. Those are the things and the metrics of achieving those outcomes, as was just said, not just measuring a whole lot of outputs.
So,
and that applies. That applies everywhere. It just doesn't apply to aged care, but it's been a very foreign idea in much of aged care.
Yeah, Mark, do you have any final thoughts on conversations in boards around what consumers might want?
Yeah, I do actually. I mean, I think the overwhelming thing is there are some brilliant case studies within aged care of customer centricity and where things are working well, and there's brilliant people. Let's not forget that. That is the reality. But it is a sector that is in need of change, and everywhere we, anybody that from a government perspective that gets involved in this, there is a call for all sorts of change that is required. So, my sense is, we have actually been in the age of the customer now for well over 10 years. Yet we're having these conversations about aged care or disability services or whatever that is so far behind where the age of the customer actually started out. And as Ian said, he's been saying for years X, Y, and Z, and some have grasped it and picked it up, and others have felt very intimidated by it, or others just are not interested. And that's okay, that's fair enough. But the reality is change is happening. It's happening because customers, residents, you look at baby boomers, people my age, we've got probably, more kind of wherewithal in terms of collateral than my parents have ever had. I know what good service looks like. I know what bad service looks like. What are my expectations going to be when I move into the aged care sector?
Mark, sorry, we've lost you, Mark. It's probably good timing, actually, because we're sort of going to be wrapping up our conversation today, but we've heard some great views from all our three panel members. I thank you so much for being part of the panel today. What I'm hearing is that that what we need is to be dealing with a whole heap of issues concurrently, as Ian sort of mentioned as we were having our discussion, which is a hugely challenging thing for leaders in the aged care sector. But I hope by listening to today's panel discussion, you've got some really good ideas on how to take that forward in your organisation. A couple of reminders as we wrap up. First of all, if you haven't already completed the diagnostic tool as part of the program, jump online and do that. There'll be some content that you can share after the webinar. The webinar's been recorded so that you can have a look at it offline as well. And we're going to have another webinar coming up, so keep an eye out for that, on the topic of building trust within the aged care sector. So I hope to see you there for the next webinar. And thank you again to our panel members. Much appreciated for you to come along to our panel and share your expertise and insights. It was a really, really valuable conversation. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.